Chapter 29 The City of Florence. Florence was Italy's leading cultural center during the Renaissance. The city was the birthplace of the great poet Dante Alighieri. The famed painter and sculptor Michelangelo grew up there. So did the brilliant thinker and artist Leonardo da Vinci. Other Florentines, such as the sculptor Donatello, also made their mark on the Renaissance. What made Florence so special? One answer is its location. As you remember from the last chapter, in Renaissance times, Italy was divided into city-states. Florence was one of these city-states. The city's location on the Arno River made it an important center for trade and commerce. Florence became the hub of woolen cloth trading for all of Europe. About 100,000 residents lived inside the city walls. Renaissance Florence was dominated by a single family, the Medicis. The Medicis acquired their wealth through Florence's major industry, banking. In the early 14th century, Florence became Europe's banking center. The banking and wool trades created wealth that supported intense cultural activity in Florence. The city and its rich residents could afford to be patrons of talented artists and thinkers. The Medicis, for example, spent lavish sums on art. Their home was a gathering place for artists, philosophers, and poets. Michelangelo once lived for a time in the Medici household, where he mingled with other artists. Over time, the work produced by Florentines inspired still more creative activity. People learned from one another, and they sometimes competed to produce even greater work. Florentines were also influenced by ideas from other places. The city drew travelers from many parts of the world. Some came to do business. Some came to study art with Florence's master artists. Others came to learn at the city's schools and libraries. These visitors brought new ideas, goods, and technologies that enlivened the city. Florentines were also inspired by the freedom of ideas that was at the core of humanism. Recall that humanists prized the individual and tried to look with fresh eyes at nature and human society. You'll see the influence of humanism throughout this chapter as you study examples of Renaissance advances. 29.2 Advances in Architecture and Engineering. You have learned that the humanist scholars of the Renaissance were influenced by classical ideas. So too were architects and builders. Renaissance architects studied Greek and Roman ruins, and they modeled their own buildings on what they learned. They were particularly attracted to rounded arches, straight columns, and domed roofs. Architects also added their own ideals to classical building styles. During the Renaissance, wealthy families built private townhouses, known as palazzi. Many had shops on the ground floor and home above. Most palazzi were built around a private courtyard, which might contain statues and other works of art. Public spaces were often influenced by humanist ideals. For example, humanists valued good citizenship. Architects designed public buildings where citizens could interact in settings that were grand yet welcoming. They used Roman-inspired roofed porches called loggia to join buildings and create outdoor plazas. Advances in engineering made new kinds of architecture possible. For instance, one of the most impressive architectural feats of the Renaissance was the great cathedral, the Duomo di Santa Maria del Fiore. Florentines started building this eight-sided cathedral in 1296, but they had to leave an opening for the dome. At the time, they didn't know how to build a large enough dome that would not collapse. It took a Renaissance architect, Filippo Brunelleschi, to solve the problem. Brunelleschi had studied ancient ruins in Rome. He had also learned about the mathematics involved in creating buildings. The dome he designed and built for the cathedral took true engineering genius. It used no internal support beams or columns. Instead, 8 huge stone arches met at the top of the dome and leaned against each other. Hoops of iron, wood, and brick wrapped around the arches, keeping them in place. Brunelleschi invented machines called hoists to raise building materials and food to workers at the top of the dome as they were building it. The magnificent dome was finished in 1436. It stood more than 300 feet above the city. It still stands today over 500 years later. From its top, you can see most of the city of Florence. 29.4 Advances in Painting. Wealthy patrons made Renaissance Florence a thriving center of art. The Medicis spent huge sums of money on fine palaces, paintings, and statues. The Palazzo Medici was filled with works of art that were commissioned by the family. Patrons like the Medicis created opportunities for talented painters who made a number of advances in style and techniques. As you learned in the last chapter, Renaissance painters were influenced by the renewed interest in classical culture and the spread of humanism. They wanted to depict real people who reposed in lifelike ways and who showed feelings. They also wanted to include realistic backgrounds. The result was a very different style from the more flat, rigid paintings of the Middle Ages. One key advance made by the Renaissance painters was the discovery of perspective. Painters used perspective to create the appearance of depth on a flat surface. Renaissance artists used several techniques to indicate depth. One was the size of objects. The smaller a painted object, the farther away it appears to be. The larger an object, the closer it appears to be. Painters also learned that a feeling of depth could be created by lines that came closer together as they receded into the distance. They discovered that careful shading could make figures and objects look three-dimensional. Adoration of the Magi, a famous painting by Sandro Botticelli, shows some of these techniques. Science and mathematics helped artists make other advances. The Florentine artist Masaccio used geometry to figure out how to divide the space in a painting to make scenes appear more as they would in real life. Leonardo da Vinci and others studied anatomy. They observed bodies and how they moved. Their studies helped them to portray the human body more realistically. Renaissance science also gave painters new materials, such as oil-based paints, to work with. Oil paint was made by mixing powdered pigments with linseed oil. This type of paint was thicker and dried more slowly than the older egg-based paint. Oil paint also allowed artists to paint over previous work and to show details and texture in new ways. 29.5 Advances in sculpture. Like painters, Renaissance sculptors were influenced by the humanist interest in realism. They were also inspired by ancient Roman statues dug up from ruins. Sculptors began carving figures that looked like real people and showed emotion. For the first time since the days of ancient Greece and Rome, sculptors made freestanding statues that could be viewed in the round. This was very different from the relief sculptures of medieval times. The new statues caused quite a sensation. They seemed to symbolize the humanist ideals of independence and individuality. Donatello, a Florentine, was one of the first sculptors to use the new, more lifelike style. His work expressed personality and mood. A good example is his statue of David, the young warrior in the Bible story of David and Goliath. In the 1500s, Giorgio Vasari, an architect and painter, wrote that Donatello's David is so natural it is almost impossible to believe it was not molded on the living form. This statue is thought to be the first life-size nude statue since classical times. Donatello's work influenced Florence's other great sculptor, Michelangelo. This famous artist is renowned both for his painting and his sculpture. He was also a talented poet and architect. Of all these arts, he preferred sculpture because it seemed to bring his subjects to life. Michelangelo created his own majestic statue of David. It may be the world's most widely admired sculpture. Carved in white marble, Michelangelo's David stands about 17 feet tall. It is famed as an ideal of male beauty, yet it reflects humanist ideas. David's expression shows the concentration and tension of a real youth on the verge of battle. Michelangelo's David was installed in the Piazza della Signoria, the plaza in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. It became the prized expression of Renaissance genius in Florence. Michelangelo had an enormous influence on other artists. Giorgio Vasari was one of his followers. He wrote, "What a happy age we live in, and how fortunate are our craftsmen who have been given light and vision by Michelangelo." 29.6 Advances in literature. Literature, like other Renaissance art forms, was changed by the rebirth of interest in classical ideas and the rise of humanism. During the Italian Renaissance, the topics that people wrote about changed. So did their style of writing and language in which they wrote. In medieval times, literature usually dealt with religious topics. Most writers used a formal, impersonal style. Most Italian writers wrote in Latin. Their work could be read only by a few highly educated people. In contrast, Renaissance writers were interested in individual experience and in the world around them. Writing about secular or non-religious topics became more common. Writers used a more individual style and they expressed thoughts and feelings about life. By the end of the Renaissance, most writers were writing in their own dialect instead of Latin. As a result, far more people could read their work. Dante Alighieri, a native of Florence, was the first well-known writer to create literature in his native language. His best-known work, The Divine Comedy, was written in the early 1300s. This long poem describes Dante's imaginary journey through the places where Christians believed the souls went in the afterlife. With the spirit of the ancient Roman poet Virgil as his guide, Dante witnesses the torments of souls condemned to infernal or hell. Virgil also takes him to purgatory, a place between heaven and hell where souls await entry into heaven. Then a beautiful woman named Beatrice shows him paradise or heaven. Like other humanist art, the Divine Comedy highlights strong emotions and the experiences of individuals. Dante's poem is a social commentary, too. It is filled with real people. The inhabitants of hell included people Dante disapproved of. People he admired appeared in heaven. Dante's work became a model for other Renaissance writers. He strongly influenced two important Florentine writers, Petrarch and Boccaccio. They described people's lives with a new intensity of feelings. Like Dante, they wrote using the local dialect, so their words touched many more people. Advances in science and math. 29.7. The Renaissance was not just a time of progress in the arts. Scholars and others also made great advances in science and mathematics. Before the Renaissance, most of what people believed about the natural world was based on ideas ancient Greek and Roman texts. As the humanist spirit took hold, people started questioning old ideas. They began carefully observing the world around them instead of relying on old books and theories. Scientists began to perform experiments. They analyzed the results using mathematics and logic. This approach to research changed the study of science. One of the most creative Renaissance thinkers was Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was an artist, a scientist, and an inventor. He studied under art masters in Florence and did his early work there. It is said that he was often to be found thinking and sketching at his favorite church, or San Michele. Leonardo was endlessly curious. He did not accept anything as true until he proved it himself. In his notebooks, he sketched and wrote about an amazing variety of topics. He wrote about geometry, engineering, sound, motion, and architecture. He studied anatomy, including the circulation of blood and the workings of the eye. He learned about the effects of the moon on Earth's tides. He was the first person to draw maps from a bird's eye view. As an inventor, he designed bridges, weapons, and many other machines. Among his many far-sighted ideas was an underwater diving suit. Another Italian scientists and mathematicians made breakthroughs as well. Girolamo Cardano solved complex equations in algebra. Cardano, who was interested in gambling, also did pioneering work in probability, the science of chance. Galileo Galilei did important experiments concerning gravity. He proved that a heavier object and a lighter object fall at the same rate. If the two objects are dropped from the same height, they reach the ground at the same time. Galileo also built the first telescope that could be used to look into space. He used his telescope to discover sunspots in the moons of the planet Jupiter. By emphasizing observation and experiment, Galileo and other Renaissance scientists paved the way for modern science. 29.8. Florentine politics. In the local government of Florence was housed in the Palazzo Vecchio. Like other Italian city-states, Florence was ruled by a governing board. As you learn in Chapter 28, however, these boards were often controlled by rich families. The powerful Medici family controlled Florence for nearly 3 centuries. The Medicis maintained their power in a number of ways. They built palaces and kept a strong military. They were involved in all aspects of life in the city. They were great supporters of artists, writers, and musicians. The Medicis also defeated enemies who plotted against the family or even to murder some of its members. One of the most powerful members of the Medicis was Lorenzo the Magnificent, a leading patron of art and scholarship. Lorenzo ruled Florence for more than 20 years, from 1469 until his death in 1492. 2 years later, a revolution forced the Medicis into temporary exile. In 1512, the family regained power. A Florentine statesman and historian, Niccolò Machiavelli, watched these struggles for power. During the Medici's exile, he reorganized the city's defenses. He also served as a diplomat and spent time observing the actions of other Italian rulers. Machiavelli drew on his experiences in a famous book called The Prince. The book was a frank account of how politics and government really worked. Machiavelli advised rulers to make their state strong by doing what worked best, rather than by being good or moral. He said that they should even lie if it helped him rule. In his view, the end or purpose justified the means. Rulers, he wrote, should be feared rather than loved. The Prince seems to contradict humanist ideals about people's goodness. Its cold realism shocked many readers, yet in other ways the book shows the influence of humanist ideas. It was the product of one individual's careful observation and thinking. It was concerned with how things really worked in the world. It also separated ideas about government from religion. In this respect, The Prince was a very modern work. 29.9. Florence Commerce and Trade. As you have learned, one reason that Florence became a cultural center was the wealth and trade and commerce brought to the city. Let's conclude our visit to Renaissance Florence with a look at this part of the city's life. The economy of Florence was unusually flexible. Its first great industry was wool and cloth making, but people often worked in several kinds of businesses. The owner of a cloth factory might also deal in banking and real estate. A grain dealer might also be a lawyer. People often belonged to several of Florence's guilds at once. The shift to a money economy during the Renaissance helped create a thriving banking industry in Florence. The Medicis, for example, started out as merchants and moneylenders. Over time, Florence became Europe's banking hub. The Medicis became one of the wealthiest families in Italy, and Florence became richer than the largest kingdoms in Europe. Popes and kings borrowed money from its 80 banks. There were two market centers in the city. At the Mercato Vecchio, people bought everyday items like vegetables, fruits, bread, fish, meat, medicine, and shoes. The Mercato Vecchio was crowded, noisy, and smelly. Still, people from all over Europe came there to buy and sell goods. The Mercato Nuovo, the new market, was built in the mid 1500s as a center for the cloth and banking industries. City officials banned food and weapons from this new market. They wanted it to be clean and orderly as a sign that commerce was highly regarded in Florence. The Mercato Nuovo became one of the largest financial marketplaces in Europe. People traveled from far and wide to get loans or to convert their money into florins, which could be used anywhere in Europe.